1929 to 1945 were years of struggle and pain for families all across Canada. Both the infamous Great Depression and the Second World War challenged Canadian families in this time period. The decade of 1929 to 1939 was a fight for survival, not only for families in Canada, but also for various countries around the world. On October 29, 1929, commonly known as Black Tuesday, North American stock markets crashed. This is thought to have been one of the major causes of the Great Depression, alongside a reduction of purchasing and bank failures. Many people lost their jobs, including parents trying to support their family. Unemployment was a huge issue, since it ultimately led to hunger and sometimes homelessness. People would have to travel across the country by train in order to find work, but it was difficult to actually find any. A big reason for unemployment in Canada was that entire companies went bankrupt. Work was hard to find, and many companies fired their female employees to make room for men, meaning women had to support their families another way. If women were lucky enough to remain employed, they received major wage cuts. Immigrants also experienced a fair amount of difficulty remaining employed or finding work. Asians and Africans that called Canada home were denied jobs, since racism and discrimination grew in Canada with the Great Depression. Due to the lack of employment and money, around 30,000 immigrants were forced back to their original countries. Immigrants were deported if they did not have a job or money. Canada's Aboriginal population was also the victim of racism and discrimination. Residential schools for Aboriginals began in Canada in the year 1870, but hit its peak in 1931 with 80 schools operating. These schools were set up by the Canadian government and Christian churches to integrate Aboriginal children into Canadian society by teaching them English and about Christianity. The children were made to live away from their families and were not allowed to practice their culture or use their language. Attendance was mandatory, and families were extremely upset with the federal government for implementing this form of education. They were sometimes living at these schools all year round. The biggest issue was that children were only allowed to write to their families in English, so most family members could not understand a letter sent home. Many children were physically and emotionally abused in these schools. More than 150 First Nations had to go through these schools. The Canadian government was not well equipped to deal with the widespread joblessness of the 1930s. Prime Minister R.B. Bennett refused to help the unemployed, saying their care was a provincial or local concern. The provinces stepped in for Canadian families and provided relief payments and food vouchers. Canadians who could prove that they could no longer support their families due to a lack of money might have been eligible to receive these grants. A family of 5 could receive $19 to $60 with relief payments. However, Aboriginals were only entitled to $5 per month. Families could only receive these grants until a child turned 16 years old. This resulted in many young men leaving home so their families could continue getting the money that they required. Vouchers were used to get food in replacement of money for those who did not have a stable income. Many never got these grants because they were either too embarrassed to apply or too ashamed to use the vouchers in public. People using the vouchers were often greeted with hurtful glares and negative comments. Unfortunately, others did not realize that it was their only option. A lack of food was one of the largest issues that came with the Great Depression. It was encouraged to grow your own food to support your family, and many Canadians did this, but it was not enough. Their next option was to reuse nearly everything, so they did. They reused bacon grease and stretched out meals by adding oats, pasta, and potatoes to meat dishes. Families would sit down to dinner and pretend to enjoy mock duck, baked beans, and macaroni and cheese on a daily basis. It even got to the point where some people resorted to stealing food for their families. Everything was homemade at this point of time. Food was grown, games were made from supplies around the house, and music was played on the piano as everyone would stand around and sing for entertainment. Clothing was even homemade and was created by using flour sacks, old curtains, and bed sheets. Children really suffered during the 30s as well. Many were forced to work at a young age. Some were even pulled from school at an early age so they could work. They typically worked on the family farm, as shoe shiners, and sold newspapers. Children also had to deal with the embarrassment of their family's struggle to find money. For example, on the East Coast, many were ashamed to have to bring lobster for lunch, since it was known to be for the poor. Some families had to send their children away to live with relatives and friends when they could no longer support them themselves. Many university students also had to leave school early because it was too expensive for families that were affected by the Great Depression. This meant that it would be hard for them to support their families in the future, since they would not be able to get a proper job. This economic tragedy also caused fewer families to immigrate to Canada. In 1929, before the Great Depression, approximately 169,000 immigrants moved to Canada. By 1933, this number had decreased immensely to just 12,000. In the midst of this economic hardship, families who could still afford to do so still enjoyed some entertainment. Movies such as Dracula, Frankenstein, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Wizard of Oz, and Gone with the Wind were all playing in theaters across Canada. At about 25 cents per ticket, movies served as a relatively inexpensive way to escape the drudgery of life in the dirty 30s. Families that still had a radio could listen to the music of the era, including Frank Sinatra, Benny Goodman, and Billie Holiday. The invention of FM broadcasting in 1933 gave Canadians more access to popular American radio shows, like Ma Perkins, Big Sister, Amos and Andy, and Fibber McGee and Molly. The Canadian Broadcasting Company also had its own programming, including the Happy Gang variety show, dance band programs, and hockey games. How great would it have been to listen to the 1932 Toronto Maple Leafs beat the New York Rangers at Maple Leaf Gardens to win the Stanley Cup. The Great Depression came to a dramatic conclusion on September 3, 1939, right as the Second World War began. On this date, Hitler's Nazi Party in Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the beginning of World War II. Canada was not obligated to go to war due to the Statute of Westminster. This law, passed on December 11, 1931, stated that Canada had full legal freedom as a country. Nevertheless, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King called on the members of Parliament to decide on Canada's role in the conflict, and on September 10, 1939, Canada joined Britain and France in the war. This meant that Canadian families had to once again say farewell to the men of their lives and hope that they would see them again. Families would host goodbye parties for their loved ones going to war to remind them of how much they were loved and would be missed. If they were lucky enough, they would also host welcome back parties for the soldiers that survived. This time around, approximately 50,000 Canadian women went to war as well, serving in the armed forces. They were nursing sisters in the Canadian Women's Army Corps, caring for injured soldiers. They were drivers, mechanics, parachute riggers, photographers, cooks, as well as wireless operators for the Women's Division of Air Force, and they were in the Women's Royal Naval Service, where they mainly helped with the Battle of the Atlantic. More than 250,000 other women were employed at home in factory assembly lines making planes, guns, and bombs to assist the war effort. Although they were still in Canada, mothers still found themselves separated from their family more than usual because of the sudden employment. Women also took over many vacant jobs that belonged to the men during the Great Depression. These jobs included working on the railroad, driving buses, running the family farm, and working in lumber mills. Since there were all of a sudden many jobs, there was less poverty and hunger for Canadian families. Everyone was encouraged to volunteer. Many did, primarily because they wished to help their loved ones away at war. People would help by collecting clothing for the Red Cross, organizing fundraisers to help pay for the cost of war, and packing food parcels to send to the men at war, as well as people in Britain who relied on imports for survival during the intense bombing of the Blitz. Many women also joined war relief clubs, where they improved the morale of the soldiers at war. They made ditty bags, which included chocolate, sewing kits, and razor blades. They also knitted scarves, socks, and mitts to send to the men. Families were nearly forced to save food. They would save things such as fats for bombs as well as bones. They often did so because they were surrounded by propaganda that included patriotic slogans such as, "Saving bones is a terrible chore, but better than the war at your door," and "Fats in the garbage won't win the war." Parents put their young children into Boy Scouts and Girl Guides for entertainment. These organizations also helped with the war effort and made the young ones very excited since they knew they were helping their mom or dad return home. They would participate in scrap metal drives and collection drives for soft drink bottles and the foil from cigarette patches. With their fathers gone and their mothers working, children learned to do things for themselves, such as cook their own meals and pack their own school lunches. Mothers also learned to simplify their cooking by making simple meals such as cornbread, salads, and casseroles on long work days. Yo-yoing and playing marbles were both popular sources of entertainment for children whose parents were busy in the war or at work. They could also jump on the trampoline if they had access to one, since it was invented in 1934. Radios became almost vital in households as a way to hear the news of the war. Televisions were not prevalent in Canadian homes, and radio provided an affordable and reliable source of news and entertainment. During the war, radio programming reflected the era, with the CBC creating a special news department to provide reports on the war effort, both at home and overseas. Radio shows were linked with the war, with shows such as Theater of Freedom, Soldier's Wife, and Fighting Navy. Listening to hockey games and music shows was also a popular pastime for families. The restrictions of the war meant that access to American comic books was cut off. In 1941, Better Comics #1 became the first Canadian comic book available for sale, and it sold 52,000 copies. Canadian comic book heroes included Freelance Dixon of the Mounties, Nirvana of the Northern Lights, and Johnny Canuck. Food began to be rationed during the war because of the lack of supplies. Soldiers needed food for bombs and other weapons, as well as for food. Canadians also needed to export food to places such as London and Glasgow for their survival. In addition, there were fewer imports from European countries due to the war. All of this meant that the food left for Canadian families needed to be shared and saved. Tea, coffee, sugar, butter, and meat were all rationed. Fighting the war gave rise to many inventions, including duct tape and the Jeep. The war effort was aided greatly by the discovery of penicillin as an antibiotic to treat wounds in 1942. World War II was the first wide-scale use of the new drug for that purpose and saved many lives. The ballpoint pen became popular during World War II, as it was less likely to leak than fountain pens. During this time period, Earl Tupper also introduced his new product to store food and keep it airtight. You might know the product better as Tupperware. During the war, children were sometimes evacuated from war zones to safer countries. Canadian families welcomed British children during the Blitz, which was one of the major events of the Second World War. The Blitz saw London and other cities attacked by enemy bombs heavily and frequently between September 1940 and May 1941. These children, referred to as the British guest children, often lived with complete strangers as an addition to their family. In total, more than 6,000 evacuees were sent to Canada during World War II. The families took them in and cared for them so that they could be safe from the German attacks in their home country. British guest children started heading back to Britain in 1942, with all children returned by February 1946. The Holocaust was the brutal treatment of Jewish Europeans by the German Nazi Party. By the end of World War II, 6 million Jews were murdered. Although Canadian families did not directly suffer from the Holocaust, Canadians were still impacted in some way. For example, at the time, Canada had immigration policies that were very restrictive. Canada denied the entry of 937 Jewish Europeans that were passengers on the MS St. Louis, including entire families. Most of these innocent people ended up dying in the Holocaust. Canada's wartime policies between 1940 and 1943 resulted in 2,300 men, mostly Austrian and German Jewish refugees, being interned as enemy aliens in Canadian camps. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, USA. On February 24, 1942, it was decided that all people in Canada of Japanese descent were to be evacuated to protective areas. Any of the Japanese family's property that could not be carried away was taken into custody, only to be liquidated on January 19, 1943. The Japanese were kept in the same stalls as horses are put. Around 20,881 people were affected, 13,309 of whom were born in Canada. After the Allied forces, including Canadian troops, pushed the Nazis back into Germany, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945. The next day, Germany formally surrendered, thus ending the biggest part of the war. Celebrations broke out across Canada on May 8, 1945, known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. Some families could look forward to being reunited with their loved ones, but more than 44,000 Canadians died in the war, which was a devastating loss for so many families. The legacy of World War II for Canada was a country with stronger and more diversified manufacturing capacity, a stronger economy, and an increase in national pride.